Hello and welcome to the final AQA AS British History Revision podcast. That is Britain 1906 to 1918, and this is Unit 5, the last one, Liberalism and the First World War. Okay, this is a super quick blitz, that's not funny, history of World War One. Okay, 1914, every country that's participating thinks it's going to be short. People are optimistic, patriotic. The British Army relied on volunteerism and it was very successful. Lots of people are joining up. They think it's going to be great. What a lovely war. 1915, we're getting into total war. Pretty much every country is now having to adjust to the demands of the war. They didn't realise it was going to be so big. In Britain, there is a shell shortage, so we get to start stockpiling weapons, bringing women into factories, and at this point there is a big coalition government between all the parties led by Asquith. 1916, you've got deadlock basically on the Western Front. There's massive casualties, but there isn't any progress. No one's advancing anywhere. They're just sitting in the trenches. Fewer people are signing up. Lloyd George wants conscription. And in 1916, you get the Second War Coalition, which has fewer Liberals in it and is now led by Lloyd George. In 1917, you start to see cracking. All the economies are struggling. Austria is close to collapse. Russia's pulling out because of internal problems. Everything's going a bit downhill. And then 1918, Germany surrendered because pretty much none of the countries could go on like this. It was too damaging. So yeah, that's a super quick history of World War One. So what happened with the politics at that point? Because obviously that's what this course is about. Okay. In 1914, when World War One starts, the Liberals are still in government. Asquith is still the Prime Minister. Lloyd George is Chancellor of the Exchequer. And they continue like that for 1914. In 1915, all the parties decide it would work better if they form a coalition. So this is the first war coalition, and it's made up of pretty much everyone, and Asquith is still leading it. There's a shell shortage, and they promote Lloyd George to Minister of Munitions because he's quite good at stuff, so they think he'll be able to solve it. Then in 1916, Asquith is not doing very well. People don't really like him. The war isn't going too well, so you've got the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Jutland, and those are making people a bit less enthusiastic about the war and giving Asquith a bit of a bad rep. Lloyd George, on the other hand, has fixed the shell shortage, and everybody's loving him. He's doing pretty well for himself. So then when the two of them get divided, and what they divide over is conscription, Lloyd George is obviously the more popular choice. So they divide over conscription because Asquith thinks that it undermines freedom of the individual, which it does. Like if you force people to join the army, that's restricting their freedom. But Lloyd George thinks it's necessary to win the war. So there's a divide there. And then Lloyd George, what he does is propose a war cabinet, so a special group of people who are in government and for the sole purpose of winning the war. And his proposed cabinet does not include Asquith, just a bit rude. So then Asquith is like, you can't do that. They have some negotiations. The negotiations break down and Asquith resigns. So then, without a Prime Minister, the obvious choice is Lloyd George because he's popular and doing very well for himself. He becomes Prime Minister and he leads the Second War Coalition, which excludes Asquith and a load of Liberals, most of the Liberals, who agree with Asquith about conscription and Lloyd George and them not being right. And so you've got the coalition Liberals, the Conservatives, Labour, Irish, all of that on one side, led by Lloyd George, and then 70% of the Liberals led by Asquith opposing them. So the sort of debate on this is about whether Lloyd George is like being selfish and only thinking about himself and his own position. So evidence that Lloyd George was only thinking about himself. He forced Asquith out by proposing the war cabinet, and he deliberately opposed Asquith's coalition and opposed him in proposing that cabinet without him. So in that he was trying to get rid of Asquith to further his own position, you could say. He sacrificed the Liberal Party because 3 out of 4 people in the cabinet, so all of the people in it that weren't Lloyd George, were Conservatives. And the Liberals, through Lloyd George splitting the party like this, are divided, and they will never be as big again. They are never going to have a majority government again. Lloyd George also sacrificed liberal beliefs through introducing conscription and through some other legislation that we're going to look at in a minute. Evidence that Lloyd George was not only thinking of himself. You could easily say that Asquith was a bad leader. He was failing in battles like the Somme and Jutland, and he was failing to deal with the Easter Rising and everything going on in Ireland. Someone else needed to take over, and Lloyd George was the best man for the job, so it wasn't really his fault. Lloyd George also believed that beliefs in things like freedom of the individual had to be set aside because it was total war. Like, they needed to put aside all their differences to win and focus on winning the war. And by 1916, the volunteerism that they were relying on wasn't working very well. People would sort of stop signing up because they'd realised they were going to die. So they needed to bring in conscription to win. You could also say that Lloyd George didn't have the hindsight of knowing that this was going to affect the Liberals badly. Like, he just thought he was doing the best thing at the time. He didn't know what damage it was going to cause. And it's quite cynical to say that Lloyd George wasn't trying to help. He was probably just a guy trying to do the best he could to win a war, rather than a guy trying to become Prime Minister at a time when being Prime Minister was going to be quite a difficult job. One thing that people said, and that we said about Lloyd George, was that he was undermining liberal beliefs, and this is why a lot of the Liberals opposed Lloyd George and his coalition. So, how did World War I undermine liberal beliefs? One key liberal belief is belief in free trade. World War I undermined this because they brought in these things called dilution agreements, which were basically like demands on trade unions of like how much stuff they needed to produce and what they needed to produce. And this obviously undermines free trade because they're telling people what to make and how much. The state during World War I owned 250 factories, which again, the state is interfering in trade and telling people what to make, so that's not free trade. And like factories had to sort of start making things for war, so again, that's not completely free trade. How did World War I undermine individual freedom? Well, in 1916, they bring in conscription for the first time, and then they extend conscription after the Battle of the Somme and in 1917 when Russia pull out, because then Germany move all their troops over to the Western Front, so we need more men. They also bring in court-martial, so shooting people in the army if they refuse to fight, so they would be tried and shot for refusing to fight. They start bringing in propaganda posters, which is kind of limiting individual freedom because they're telling people what to do again effectively through these posters. And then there's the Defence of the Realm Act, and that's in 1914. And what that does is introduce censorship, and it introduces British summertime, so daylight saving time, and it means a lot of other things like you can't talk about war in public and stuff like that, which is obviously limiting people's individual freedom. Liberals have also traditionally believed in having a balanced budget, and World War I completely obliterates their balanced budget by increasing their debt by 1,200%. Yeah, 1,200%. debt increase. And they're borrowing mainly from America, but that's a big increase, so that's not really a balanced budget. So with all this new legislation, like DORA, Defence of the Realm Act, a question that you can ask is, or that they could ask you, is did the state control British society? So yes, they did. They brought in conscription and extended it. They brought in propaganda and censorship. The dilution agreements controlled trade unions and therefore all the workers. Defence of the Realm Act controlled what people could talk about and made everyone go on a different time in the summer, and censorship again came under that. Rationing is obvious, a really obvious, easy example of state controlling society. How you can say the state did not control society. They didn't completely control the trade unions. There were still some strikes. An example of that is the Clydeside strike. Before 1916, when they brought in conscription, they were relying on volunteers, so that's not controlling individual freedom. The state can't control religion. They can't control what individuals believe, so they can't completely control society. And although there were like Zeppelin raids and stuff in 1915, there's not much going on the home front for most people. So even though they had all this stuff going on, all this legislation, most normal people, like their day-to-day lives, weren't that affected. So they didn't manage to control the whole of society. Another question about the impact of World War I would be something like, did World War I change British society? And then I can't remember what paper it was, but there was a past question about, did it change society for the better? So reasons that it did. The percentage of people in deep poverty decreased because there were stable jobs and stable prices, because they fixed prices and they made sure that if there's a war going on and you work in a munitions factory, your job is going to be, you're going to be in work until the war is over. So that's quite a stable job position to have. And so they've got a steady income. And this means that, society is generally better for workers because there are lots of good jobs going. There was also less class division overall, like people, this sort of general snobby attitude of the Victorians sort of disappears because everyone is being affected by the war. Like, everyone's being rationed, everyone's involved, most people have lost someone in their family. Like, the war is something that affects everyone, so there's generally less sort of division, and like social mobility increases. World War I is also pretty good for women. They managed to be 80% of the workforce during World War I, because obviously all the men are fighting, and in this time they really proved to people that women can do this stuff just as well as men can and challenge gender roles, which is good in the long term for them. And then in 1918 they get the vote, which a lot of people believe is because of the way that they helped out during the war. Then you got your reasons for why World War I was not a good change for British society. Education was disrupted because all your teachers are going off to fight or work in factories, and a lot of kids are working as well, and if the kids are 18, they're also being conscripted. Class division and change in like women's roles was sort of happening anyway. And you could say that even without World War I, women would have got the vote because of the suffragettes. The changes for women weren't permanent. Like, when the war ended, they just sort of went back to their houses, a lot of them. And there was still like a wage gap and discrimination and stuff. And then the most obvious one, it clearly wasn't good for Britain because there was a massive death toll and a massive debt. People came back injured, disabled, with post-traumatic stress disorder. There were loads of like single parents because everyone's dads are dying. all these returning soldiers need someone to provide for them, or the state to provide for them. And then obviously, yeah, it's like, it's not a good thing to be in a massive world war. So what was the effect of World War I on British politics? For the Liberals, they are now completely divided because of the split over conscription. Asquith loses his seat and the being Prime Minister. Lloyd George is now Prime Minister, but again, his party is really divided, and they will never be as big as they were then. Well, I mean, they could be, but didn't go that way. Couple of weeks ago. Right, for the Conservatives, the War Coalition gave them some power. They were united because they will support the war. Nationalism and like patriotism from the war boosts their image and like gives them a really good rep, and so they win the election in 1918 after the war. Effect for Labour, they were initially divided over the war, like some of them didn't really agree with it morally, but they joined the War Coalition, so they have some power. They help negotiate with the trade unions and keep them on the government's side, so they have a lot of influence, and they gain like more respect. And then in 1918, they're pretty much the opposition, the main left opposition. For the Irish nationalists, they do really badly because the Easter Rising and the government's reaction to it makes people want independence rather than home rule, or, you know, people in what is now Southern Ireland. And Sinn Féin, basically you just take all their seats and make them like 100% irrelevant. Yeah, so that is the effect of World War I on the British political parties. And that is it. We've now completed the whole of this AS level in 5 videos. If you've watched all of them, I hope it helped you, and thanks for sticking with them because they were really long and boring probably. And good luck on Wednesday, everyone.